and welcome to this webinar, Principles and Practice of Intercultural Dramaturgy. I'm Ciara Murphy, the Vice President of the Irish Society for Theatre Research, and you're all very welcome. I'm not going to take too much of your time, but I just want to introduce our two wonderful speakers, Dr. Sarah Hoover and Dr. Karen Jean Martinsen. So Sarah is a dramaturg, lecturer and researcher focusing on immersive and interactive performance and audience-centered dramaturgy. Her specialisms include artistic research methodologies, new material feminisms, and multimodal digital humanities approaches. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway, working on the EU Horizon 2020 project CLS Infra. Her forthcoming book, Reflective Effective Dramaturgies, LARPing Audiences into Theatre, is out next year with Palgrave Macmillan, and I personally cannot wait to read that. Karen Jean Martinsen is an assistant professor of dramaturgy in the School of Music, Dance and Theatre in the Herberger Institute for Design and the Arts at Arizona State University. Her scholarly and creative work explores the intersection of contemporary US-American performance, consumer culture, neoliberalism, and the processes of identification, interrogating use of race, class, gender, and sexuality. She also writes and talks constantly, her words, about dramaturgy and dramaturgical thinking. So I think we're in for a brilliant conversation, and I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Sarah Hoover.
Thank you, Ciara. I have to say, I think we're in an amazing room full of people. I recognize several names from their dramaturgical writing and experience. So welcome to all of you, whether or not you have any background in dramaturgy. I wanted to start off by explaining why I've brought Dr. Karen Jean Martinsen in to speak to us and how that came about. I am on the executive committee of ISTR, so it was a natural progression for me. But how this happened is I work as a dramaturg often for Galway Theatre Festival, one of the few major festivals in Ireland to ensure that there is dramaturgical support for most of the new play productions, and was assigned to work with Esther Almazan, who is writing a play called Yaki and Bale, Yoemi and Irish in Conversation. It's a wonderful piece about her experience as a Yoemi person coming to Ireland and discovering the history of the industrial schools here, and resonating with the intergenerational traumas that have some similarities and some differences with the boarding schools, what are often called the Indian schools in the United States. So knowing that I'm not an intercultural dramaturg, that's not my area of expertise, I reached out for some mentorship to someone who had worked with Esther before, and that's Dr. Karen Jean. And it's just been a wonderful, very fruitful set of conversations for me, and I wanted to share that expertise then across the ISTR group. So that's how we got here. We'll probably use the play Yaki and Bale as an example for many of the things that we're talking about, because both of us tend to drill down to the applied version of our highly eclectic theories. So I do want to say that we are talking about not just intercultural drama here, but also the use of storytelling to bridge the gap and perhaps heal some of the intergenerational traumas that have occurred in both Ireland and in what we, as Esther says, it's the United States, but only because the border crossed her and her culture. So if you are concerned about that, please feel free to step out at any time and manage your own trauma responses any way you need to. So one of the first question that I always get asked when I say I'm working as a dramaturg is, what's that? What is a dramaturg? What does the dramaturg do? So I'm going to pass that over to Karen Jean as the expert in the room. When you get asked that question, what do you say?
Great. Thank you. First of all, hello to everybody. It's really exciting to be in this room with so many great people. And yes, I recognize name and I actually cite people's names. And so I've never said some of these names out loud. So if I mispronounce your name, please correct me, but also offer me grace in that. And before I get started, I just want to share a land acknowledgement. This is something that is very common in the United States and Canada as we try to grapple with our legacy of colonialism. And so I am zooming in from the lands of the Akimel Ockham and the Peeposh, which is known by the colonial name of Phoenix, Arizona, where it is a bright and sunny morning here. So I'm really happy to be here. So what is dramaturgy is, yes, as you said, Sarah, this is a question we all get asked all the time. And I feel like my definition for it shifts all the time because, as any dramaturg will tell you, it always varies according to the practice and the production that you're working on. But I have been collecting definitions that I like that I'll share a few with you, and then I will share my most current iteration of this. Michael Mark Chambers describes the dramaturg as somebody who pays attention to the aesthetic architecture of a piece and then puts that to use through research and application to bringing a text into a living production. Let's see, who else do I love? Jeff Prohl talks about dramaturgy as a sensibility that recognizes abundance and loss in the staging of everything and is constantly in motion in relationship to that as you're working on a production. Mark Bly, who's sort of the father of American dramaturgy, says the dramaturg is the artist who helps the director and other artists shape the sociological, textual, directorial, acting, and design values that are used for production. There's another piece, again, I don't know exactly how to say this name, but Mikey Bleeker talks about dramaturgy as responsibility, both responsibility in the sense that we think about it, but also borrowing from Donna J. Haraway, response and ability in our shifting and care, whenever we're working on a production that is both responsive to the process, drawing on our talents, but also caring for the process. Two more that I'll throw out there. Teresa Lang talks about dramaturgy as curating an experience and how important that is for us. I guess that was the last one I want to share because now I'll share my own. The most recent iteration of this that I've talked about is dramaturgy is a commitment to evocative storytelling created through thorough analysis, extensive research, intentionality, and deep critical inquiry. And I think that in a production, the value of a dramaturg is that there is somebody there who can keep the whole view or the total view of the production in mind in those moments where other artists working in collaboration go into their own special areas, and their specificity of their responsibility, that the dramaturg is there to kind of hold on to a lot of this, but always to be in conversation with everybody around it. So that's my current one. And what I love about it, I will say, is that I love that theater is ultimately a public art form that has the capacity to impact audiences, to start dialogues, to create new possibilities. And for me, dramaturgy allows me as a non-performer and as a scholar, a researcher, a writer, and a teacher to bring all those skills and talents to the production and to the audience that gets to engage with it.
And there's a couple of things there that resonate with me and that I think will carry us forward into a conversation about intercultural dramaturgy. Care and curation as two sides of the same coin. The depth of research and engagement and the breadth of view that one has to have as audience representative, as sometimes a translator between the script and the director, or script and the cast. All of those things very much come into play when positioned as an intercultural dramaturg. Intercultural, we were fortunate in that, like Dr. Charlotte McIver is an intercultural theater expert at the University of Galway. So any of you who are at University of Galway, you have great access to her. Talks about new interculturalism in particular as ensuring that how does she put it? Let me see here. The new interculturalism is driven from minority and subaltern voices. We have to be careful of that trap that earlier intercultural theater often fell into, in borrowing from or appropriating forms or even directly the text and putting it into a Western format that didn't suit it and that loses the specificity of those voices. And I know that's been a big concern of yours. Can you speak a little bit to how you approach intercultural dramaturgy?
Sure. And actually, I'll share one more definition. And this is another name that I'm not sure of. And who is in the room? It's Catalin Trencen. Oh, I knew I was just going to screw it up. Trencenzi. No, Trencenyi, I believe. Catalin, please, apologies to you. But in their book on intercultural dramaturgy, in New Dramaturgy, she says, by interculturalism, we understand that we no longer live in a monolithic culture, but are surrounded by multiple value systems and cultures which are often intertwined and between which we negotiate. And this is reflected in the processes and product of theater making. We consider interdisciplinarity as being part of interculturalism, as it is an exchange between different knowledge systems and the cultures of those self-same knowledge systems. So I think that's a really great definition of interculturalism and intercultural dramaturgy, in that it speaks to both the products and the processes and our need to be attentive to both. And that recognizing that these are not just, in the case of Yaqui and Beal, stories, but actually an exchange of knowledge systems. And so I think that's really important for us to keep in mind. To return to your question, Sarah, of what were some of the concerns, when we staged Indian School, which was Esther's MFA applied project, so this was the culmination of her degree, we staged it at Arizona State, obviously, and that is a predominantly white institution. And so a lot of the concerns that we were about presenting this story ethically. And we had the majority of the artists involved were indigenous peoples who carried with their cultural knowledges. So that was quite comfortable in the production process, but how our audience is going to take this, especially if we consider what Danny Snyder Young talks about as the privileged spectatorship in which white audiences often place themselves. And how do we disrupt the idea that simply going to see the show and feeling sad about what had happened to the characters in the show would amount to having done something, right? We wanted to make sure that we provided ways of access to it, but also ways of action out of it, so that we couldn't say, oh, I felt something and therefore I am absolved of any more responsibility to this. And this led to questions about empathy, questions about narrative, questions about storytelling, and how do we share that. And so for a lot of the dramaturgical work surrounding the production, we worked very hard to try to have points of engagement and points of action that the audience could do things with, and to say, basically to say, it's not enough to listen. Although I will also add that hearing the stories are incredibly important as well, right? And that's something that you and I have talked about with Yaqui and Beal, and the kind of changes that have occurred from that script from Indian School, that the act of storytelling is an act of healing, the act of storytelling is an act of resistance and resilience. And that is also important, especially for the Native audience members who did come to the show as well.
So let's talk a little bit about that in order to actually center those storytelling methods. Because we are talking about events in the history of Ireland and the history of what's now Arizona that involve intergenerational trauma, most often perpetrated through shame,
Yep.
or let's not say most often, because the physical impacts are probably carry intergenerationally as well. But the continuing, as our own Miriam Houghton talks about, the continuing impact of shame as an oppressive force. Your theories about how storytelling resists that, how even listening to storytelling, if understood in the proper context and followed by the politicized action that Rick Knowles talks about as intercultural, the potential of intercultural theater, that storytelling can be a means of, as I see it in Yaki and Bale, creating solidarity between two people who have experienced some similar institutionalized education-based institutionalized shaming.
Yeah.
So
I think
storytelling, yeah.
Storytelling and that, maybe I'll start by just kind of talking a little bit about the research surrounding intergenerational trauma and how this interweaves in it. And I think it's really important in both of these instances to note that education, as you mentioned, was used as cover for some atrocious acts, right? And even at the time, there were people who were calling this out. There's newspaper articles and articles in different magazines in the United States that were saying, they say this is education, but this is actually creating for them a system of oppression, right? So there were voices against this from the beginning, but I think the idea that it was education allowed people who didn't care to dig any deeper to say, oh, isn't that nice that we're educating, right? And I think this is a very common tactic of there's something wrong in the culture, in the native culture, that must be educated, and to use the terms of the time, civilized, in order to help these people. And that allows for all of this abuse and oppression to happen, right? And so the children who were taken away are meant to feel shame about their culture, and they're also subjected to a system of humiliation and shame in their daily lives if they spoke their native language, if they had a very normal trauma response of like wetting the bed or crying, if they didn't take their beatings with silence and appreciation, they would have these responses, right? And then made to feel shame. And actually public shaming was very much a part of the whole system at these boarding schools, right? And so that shame becomes internalized, and that shame then goes on to cause historical trauma. And I think it's really important to note that the Indian schools were primarily in the 19th century, but they continued into the 20th century in the United States. And certainly the intergenerational trauma that comes from that is present today. Like, this is not in the past, it is present, right? And some of the research coming out of Canada, which also had the residential schools, which are the same system essentially, notes that it takes 10 years of continuous healing before a community begins to actually become secure in that healing, right? And that healing has to be led by, in the case of the Indian schools, native spiritual practices. But as you said, it has to be driven by minority and subaltern. The people who have been oppressed need to be the ones who are guiding that healing, not the oppressive forces who often step in, right? And storytelling does become a huge part of that, because storytelling is the way to begin to dissipate the shame. First of all, saying something out loud is claiming it in a different way, making it public and saying, I will no longer keep this hidden, right? And then it also allows us to put the shame where it rightly belongs, which is on the oppressive system itself. The system of the boarding schools, we should be ashamed of that, and not the individuals who managed to survive it. And it said one survivor of the boarding school, she said, I didn't just survive it, I conquered it, right? Through storytelling, through sharing of this. And so it's vital to the healing process. It is so important to the way we as communities can come out of this and can can heal all of us on all sides of it, but most especially those who were the victims of it.
It's and it's especially interesting to me in Yaqui and Vale because we are following Esther's experience of discovery as she comes from that culture that has experienced the residential schools and discovers the way that Ireland, and particularly rural Ireland, is working through its own traumas with the mother and baby homes, the Magdalen laundries, and the industrial schools, as each stage of those have been finally claimed by the Irish government. So for me, what's really interesting about Yaqui and Vale is that I think I might be the only person involved in the performance at all that doesn't come from one of those two cultures. Mm-hmm. So obviously that has to come for me with an establishment of my own set of principles for how I'm going to proceed, which is led by particularly Esther, but also the other people in the cast and crew. But the solidarity as healing side of it, like you were saying, the storytelling part of it, especially telling those stories through your own cultural traditions to another culture that doesn't have the same storytelling traditions, but has experienced some of the same traumas, creates this feedback loop.
Yeah.
And I think my role as dramaturg has been to help Esther and Raphael, the director, center those moments of trading stories. So it really makes sense to me what you're saying about storytelling and sharing stories as part of the healing process.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak briefly to the form of storytelling that you worked with in Esther's Indian school and that you see in Yaqui and Vale? Because I think that'll be interesting.
I think it's super exciting to see how it's changed. And I feel like the changes in Yaqui and Vale are stepping into those different knowledge systems rather than meeting it to fit a knowledge system of Western theater, because Indian school was a narrative drama, and it was dependent upon, sort of toggled between past and present to make clear how this trauma remains. And one of the interesting parts of it that I don't know that our audiences got, because we had to talk about it a lot as the production staff, because we had missed it as well, is Esther was actually quite clear that when we see these images of the past, the main character's name is Charlie, and he was taken and brought to an Indian school. And he is convinced, he's sort of a distant man who is convinced that it was good for him, that he had good lessons that he learned from this. He learned God, he learned order, he learned discipline, all these things, but it has also estranged him from his community, not because the community won't welcome him back in, but because he has taken on this idea that they are uncivilized, that they are disordered, that they are, to use the term he uses in the play, savages. And so he's taken on this view that was instilled in him, but he asserts that the Indian school was good for him. So as we're toggling between Charlie and young Charlie in the past and witnessing it, he is actually not privy to those memories. They are for the audience, but he has so cut them off, right? Until he begins the process of healing that happens at the end of the play. So it's interesting that it gets set in this form that is following, basically a Western tradition of, I will share this story with you in this way, right, as this narrative that we all come to engage with. And now what Esther has done is really centered her journey, as you mentioned, but also she's sort of just plucked out the really important stories, and they are shared as stories, not as memories within an embedded story of this person, Charlie. And I think that's really interesting, because I think it can be very easy for us to, as I mentioned, sort of fall into privileged spectatorship, to look at this and we're empathizing with it, but our empathy only goes so far. And I'm thinking of Nadine George Graves writes this about the Raisin in the Sun and some of her conflicting, she's an African-American scholar, has conflicting views about teaching this, especially teaching it in a mixed race classroom where there are people from all over. And she's saying, what she has come to suspect about empathy is that it can allow yourself to imagine yourself in others people's suffering, but it remains focused on the self. And so she says the empathy is for oneself and not the other. So I can take this on and think, oh, that sounds so terrible for me, and wear it that way, in a way that's ultimately self-serving. And there's another, we talked about this, we had a pre-conversation yesterday where we were talking about this, but there's an op-ed piece in the New York Times that also talks about this with Killers of the Flower Moon, as perhaps we rely too much on empathy in these narrative storytelling, the assumption that that's going to make everybody feel and feel that they have to then act. And she's talking about how the movie actually centers on the white male, and we see him as in his faults, and rather than empathy, perhaps it's trying to evoke in us shame to recognize our own complicity in these systems. So all of that is to say, I think what's really interesting about stripping it down to stories and the exchange of stories is the sort of moving it out of this understanding of it through the frame of empathy and moving it into a place of much more pure exchange, right? Especially because you have in the script those moments where the audience is invited to share their stories that might get devised as well. And so we might hear more stories from people who are actually in the room. So we are all sort of present together in storytelling rather than passively sitting back and watching a story unfold. I think that's really, really powerful. And I have done a lot of research around the way Indigenous cultures use stories and share stories as knowledge systems. And I just want to share this quote. This is from Thomas King. His study is called The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative. And he opens each chapter of this with a retelling of a similar story, but with these slight differences. And he ends each chapter by saying, take this story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now. And I feel like that impulse is also in Yaqui and Baal. You have heard this now. You must do something with it, or not, but you have heard it, and you cannot say you have not heard it, right? Yeah. I'll throw it back to you to just see if you'd like to comment on that exchange as you're seeing it play out.
Yeah, I think that form of storytelling in particular, but also some of the more Irish traditional storytelling that Esther has collaborated with some other authors to help shape, some Irish authors to help shape. Both of those give some responsibility to the listener, to the witness, to carry that story and to do something with it. So you get some ownership over it, as in, like you were saying yesterday, the essence of it remains the same, even though perhaps the characters are named different names, or perhaps it's framed differently as being told by a different storyteller. So there are changes that can happen to that story as it moves from person to person and from generation to generation. But the responsibility to carry and continue to tell it also goes with it. So again, I think part of my job, perhaps our jobs as dramaturgs, is to help the audience understand what their responsibility is to these stories and how to responsibly, ethically carry them forward. So as part of the dramaturgy that I'm doing for Yaqui and Baal, we are working with having the audience choose if they'd like to write letters So people on the other side of the ocean, on the other side of the story, and create an exchange there. We'll also be doing a lot of the traditional audience-focused dramaturgy, like lobby display on the things that the survivor groups are currently fighting for. For example, I just read a story the other day that the redress money for the mother and baby homes, the compensation that the Irish government has promised and set aside, is still not being distributed. It's been delayed 3 or 4 times now, and they promise Q1 of 2024. So I guess we'll see. But that just shows that they're beyond just the cultural significance and the social and emotional significance of telling and retelling these stories, of not losing their impact. There is a material impact that is still happening, and getting people on side is part of our job as dramaturgs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was thinking about this this morning with the idea of what's the responsibility of the story, because it is often framed as being given as a gift, and so then that perhaps suggests that there's no responsibility, except for obviously that's not what we're going for. And then I was reminded of Robin Wall Kimmerer, her book Braiding Sweetgrass. She's an indigenous botanist who has these beautiful short essays about how if we infuse indigenous knowledges with our current knowledges, what we can gain from that, right? And she talks about the gift economy, and she's saying that gifts are actually, we have to stop looking at them as commodities, as products. And we talked about this yesterday too, of like, in some ways, this distrust I have of empathy is because it is falling into a consumer model, right? Of a product of theater that I have paid money to go see, and then I feel a certain way, and then I go home and live my life, right? And I think this storytelling exchange is moving out of that, because when we see things as commodities, then it's there for exploitation, it's there for our use, right? So that gift becomes a thing I get to use, and then I'm done with it. And what she's talking about is that in gift economies, gift exchange is the commerce of choice. It is the commerce that harmonizes with or participates in the process of nature's increase, right? That a true gift economy, while it's not required that you give something back, giving around gifts of these stories, of sharing these experiences, leads to abundance, not the taking of, but adding to. And I think that's present in Yaqui and Beal, right? That we are giving all of that, and increasing. And I think that even your dramaturgical activity, as you're talking about it, like, let's write letters, let's share more stories, let's do this, is all about increase and abundance rather than something that's contained. And I think that's powerful.
Particularly as we're talking about histories of containment, the use of who says that, architectures of containment. I bet Miriam knows.
Somebody out here knows.
Yes, the phrase architectures of containment. Do you know, Miriam, where that comes from?
James Smith, says Kate McCarthy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, in that those histories of architectures of containment are present in both cultures. Yeah. So anything that seeks to contain, I'm a bit resistant to that for this particular play. And I think this conversation right there speaks to, the webinar is called Practices and Principles of Intercultural Dramaturgy, but they are so specific to recognizing the form of the cultures and the cultural storytelling that you're dealing with. You have to be as true as possible to those forms and formats.
Yeah,
maybe.
Absolutely. And I was just going to add that I think that's the dramaturgs. That's a perfect. If dramaturgy is always sort of adaptive to the production, having a person who's really thinking about process, really asking these questions about, are we being ethical in this exchange? Are we attentive to it? Is a perfect slot for a dramaturg to be thinking about, right? It's sort of a natural understanding and advancement of the things that we often are thinking anyways.
Yeah. So do you want to speak a little bit to the drilling down to the very practical? What were the things that you did as a dramaturg for Indian school? What was your focus, and what were the outcomes of that might be useful for other people to know?
Yeah, sure. I think they were necessarily limited by budget and time constraints, unfortunately, but we were thinking about how do we share more stories, first of all. And so we had one of the things we did in the lobby is we had a big display with some of the images of the Indian schools. There's a great photographic record of it, and so we had a lot of those pictures, and we really tried to make them, we don't want to indulge in trauma, right? And so choosing images that evoked some of the horror of the place without also like becoming a spectator sport, right? So we had just the images of like the children at the desks, and you can see in their faces how uncomfortable they are. The images of what they would take pictures of the children as they came in and then they got their haircut, which is extremely traumatic and against Native spiritual practices. And then they were dressed in Western clothes. So they take a picture like a before and after. And, I think in the 19th century, this was meant to be something that like, look, we have civilized this human, and now we look on it with horror, right? So we had that paired with a beautiful poem about the boarding schools and about people escaping. So that was meant to be just a spot where you could sort of meditate and draw your own conclusions. And then we had some facts about the Indian schools because they are still present, and they were not as huge, it was hugest, it was a sort of most robust in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but they continued, and there are some that are still in operation now, largely overseen by Native people. So they're doing something very different. But, in Phoenix itself, one of our major streets is Indian School Road. And there are people in Phoenix who don't know why it's called Indian School Road. And there is the remains of the Indian school that is there. So that's one thing we did. We also had stories. Esther had written a short story based on a short playlet based on, I guess it was more, just a monologue based on a story that one of her relatives had shared with her about their mother escaping the Indian school. And she took a horse and rode off and never went back. And it's this very triumphant story. Another woman who was involved in the production is a cultural consultant, Nora Cherry. Her mother actually went to the Indian school in Phoenix and left willingly because her family was in poverty. And so this became a way for her to seek education. And this is obviously in the 20th century. So it's moving away from some of those practices, but also maybe, we don't know because she didn't talk about that, but so Nora shared her mother's story. So we had those ways of engaging with it so that we could hear at least a diversity of voices. And we had hoped to do more of those, but just, time and money. So we ran out of that. We also had in the dramaturgical display itself, we had letters get used in Indian school. And so we asked people to write a letter to an audience member so that you could exchange letters. So, but now we're formalizing, it sounds like that with Yaqui and Bayal and across these continents, but we had those there for people to share experiences with. And then we really tried to bring it to the local. So we had a history of the Phoenix Indian School so that people could no longer say, oh, I didn't know we had that. It's like, now right? You've heard the story now. And then a final thing that we did was demonstrated how people can take action by calling their congressperson or senator, an elected official. And so we would call And this is an idea I stole from Donatella Galella, which I saw her do at an ATHA conference. So shamelessly stole it from her, but I've credited her whenever I can. But she actually demonstrated, like, she had call it up and like, here's what you have to do. You have to say your name, you have to say your zip code, and then you state your issue. And in the US, it's the most effective way to get your opinion heard, because unlike emails, unlike online petitions and the like, when you call of elected official's office, somebody has to answer it and they have to log it. So that translates into time and money, pay for some intern to actually write this down and take it. And so these actually have an outsized impact. And so we would call and just say, at the time, this was during the era of increased border surveillance under the Trump administration and family separation. And so we were seeing so many resonances between the Indian schools and the detainment of children at our southern border. And so I could demonstrate, I'm going to call Martha McSally and I'm going to tell her this needs to end, and that it's linked to a legacy of oppression and colonialization. And we need to end family separation, and we also need to apologize. The federal government needs to issue an apology for the Indian school boarding, the boarding school system, right? And so you could just do that. And so we would do that before the audience every night. And to much, people were really excited about it and cheered. And then we also made cards that had the phone numbers of our 2 state senators, where to look up your state representative, because that would be different from where people, that's much more local. So it's, they would have to find that information, but how do you could get that? And then we had the basic script. Hi, my name is blank. My zip code is blank, and I am calling about blank. And we had to do it blank, because we had to not express a political opinion through, as an ASU event, we couldn't, say call for this thing. But in my demonstration, I could just happen to mention that we were against the boarding schools. So we gave people action items that they could do. And we also had links in, and information on where to find other resources for people who are actually healing from boarding school experiences.
Yeah, I'm fortunate in that I can borrow many of those things. And
absolutely, let's steal our best ideas and share them, or not.
Right.
I shouldn't say steal. Let's gift them to each other.
And many people in Ireland have done the same with advocacy for industrial schools, medical and laundries, mother and baby homes as well. So fortunately, there's a lot of legacy to lean on. And I think that's part of being a dramaturg, is doing that research as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm aware of the time, and I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, because I think this can be a very fruitful conversation. Obviously, it is between the two of us, and I'm sure other people have some comments too. Just to kind of actually to sum up, in looking at intercultural dramaturgy, then I would say we are responsible for looking at the relationship between aspects of communication in the audience's culture, the cultures represented on stage, and our own, whatever culture we come from as dramaturgs. And then being responsible for holding a dynamic, what Richard Jones calls a dynamic in-betweenness, that has my favorite word, rhizomatic, popping up in all areas of theater making. Do you have anything that you want to close with, Karen?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know how this is in Ireland, but obviously in the United States, we are still sort of grappling with our racial past and present, our histories of oppression and colonialization. And a lot of times that comes down to individual identity, right, as a sort of shorthand for this. And I think we're trying to figure that out. and I'm reminded, I just reread an article in Magda Romanska's Routledge Guide to Dramaturgy. He's talking about intercultural dramaturgy, and he's talking about working on a production where he, as a South Korean man, was working on a production that was led by women. He was actually the only woman in the process, or the only man in the process, and the play features one offstage man, but is all female actors, and they were international, Black from various nationalities, and he was the dramaturg for this. And it's about being mindful, I think, of your own, as you said, your own identity, the identities being represented on stage and the audience that's coming to it. But I think it's also important that we take the risk to do this work, that we engage in this, because the alternative is to shut down and to retreat into our identities, and that's not going to solve these problems. So while we have to be mindful and incredibly concerned with the ethical practices and make sure that we're not falling into privileged behaviors and appropriative behaviors, we also have to do this work, right? And years ago, I saw Anna DeVere Smith give a speech, and she said, we have to step out of the safe houses of our identities and meet in the crossroads. And I think that's what intercultural dramaturgy is asking us to do, and be very mindful of this, that you don't just, gleefully walk out of your house and whatever, but that we're really taking account for who and where we are. But the important thing is that we are having these intercultural conversations, and that we can do so ethically and in a way that benefits the entire process.
Yeah, I'd say that's a pretty amazing point to end our duo conversation on. So I want to open it up to anyone who might have any questions. Maybe Kira can see better in the chat if there were any questions there. I'll see if I can pull it up myself.
So all clear in the chat, Sarah, so far?
Thank you. Great.
Just to let people know, the chat box is open, I think, and the chat certainly, or sorry, the Q&A box is, and the chat is as well, for people to relay any questions.
Or comments or thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I see there was someone who had a question. Yes, please.
Please ask a question.
Sorry,
Yes.
I got one. May I?
Yay, there we are.
Great.
I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry. Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much. It was actually very engaging and very interesting as a topic. I must say that in the sort of like cultural landscape I work on, this is not really a hot topic, I would say. So that was very informative. And I saw you mentioned something about language, the coexistence of different languages. And I wanted to ask, in practice, during the performance, how important is interlingualism? And if the dramaturg has some sort of course, input, yes, of course. But I mean, how viable is the concurrent use of different languages in the US, in your areas, for example, or in Ireland? I know it would be different in different countries. Like I know that interlingual dramaturgy is a reality in Northern Europe, for example, in Germany already, which is my area, but not in Italy, which is where I am from. So yeah, I'd like to ask that, if I may.
I'll jump in quickly and say that I spend about half my time living in Belgium, where the question of what languages appear on stage in surtitles and subtitles and in people's mouths, and which people, is definitely something that the interlinguality what you said, the linguistics of that is very political. So it's definitely something that the dramaturg has to work through.
Yeah, and I'll add, you know, in the US, I think the way this often plays out, like in Latinx theater in the US, there was a big push to use Spanish without translation, and that being a sort of, you know, and it's an interesting dramaturgical question. I worked on a show, it was a new play in development a few years ago where the playwright had decided to do that, and what was actually funny about it is in the play, one person is actually pretending to be a Spanish speaker, but is not. So they're using Google Translate. So Spanish is actually, there's lots of weird mistakes. And then the other, the person that they're speaking with is a native speaker. But none of that was translated. So it was funny for Spanish speakers to catch some of these jokes, right, of like missteps or whatever. But that was not a joke that was made. We didn't translate. We had translations available through, this was during COVID, so it was an outdoor reading. So you could access it on the app to read the thing, but we didn't have any presentations, and we did that decidedly. And it was interesting because in Arizona, which is, you know, there's a large Latino population here, people were mad about the fact that we didn't offer that translation. And then the director said, you know, when, you know, she said, one audience member came up to me yesterday and said, this is so exciting because I've never felt welcomed into a space like this before because my native language was being spoken, right? So it's like, which audience do we serve, I think is a really important question as it's played out in the US. And I know we have a tendency, obviously, as playwrights, especially, they want their message to be heard. So they may offer translations, but I think the way they do that is a way to, you know, there's ways to do it and so that the translation comes later, so we'll pick up on it or we get it from the context. And I think that's really important for these kinds of contexts, especially.
And I'll add to that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. No. Sorry. It was just a commentary. I was thinking, yeah, of course, and it is like a stage effect, as it is supposed to. Yeah, it is something that is wanted. The externality is something that must be felt in this specific place where it is supposed to be happening. Of course, not every time. But yeah, sorry, you were saying. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. Moonfish Theatre, Galway native Moonfish Theatre, does an amazing job, particularly in like Star of the Sea, at, if you are not an Irish speaker, you don't understand the words that are being written on the screen. But one of the characters is also a non-native Irish speaker and is learning a little bit of Irish. So we're kind of, if you can identify with different characters in that. So again, part of the role of a dramaturg there, and Miranda Cronin does most of their dramaturgy, and she's amazing, so they don't need another. But part of the role of the dramaturg is to kind of put yourself in the place of different kinds of audience member and feel through where those moments of discomfort are. And if those moments of discomfort match the director's vision, if that's what's meant to happen.
Yeah.
We don't always have to make the audience comfortable. We have to make them uncomfortable in the ways that make sense for the story.
That's really nicely said. That Nicole Brewer, who does a lot of anti-racist workshops, says something similar in a HowlRound piece of like, we should all be welcome to come to attempt this work, but discomfort is part of the process, right? And that we can use that in our theatrical practices as long as we're being intentional about it.
All right, thanks. And how, if I may ask something else, how was it exactly how was this practically happening in the case of Indian School? Was there any interlingualism? Or just words now and there? Or were there conversations that were not meant to be understood by the teachers? Like how was it?
Yeah, in that case, not that much. There were a few words that would eventually be translated, but it was very smattering, in part because Charlie, the main character, doesn't know that culture. So he's separated himself from it. So there was a little bit. And the other thing I'll say is that we, as part of the show, there's the healing ritual that the sisters attempt for Charlie using native practices, which we did not base on an actual ceremony. We were very intentional about not trying to represent that. And in fact, in our opening, we did a sort of land acknowledgement opening discussion before the play started, and we were very clear in that you're not seeing actual ceremony. This is made up, and it's embedded in the script that it's made up, but it's also made up because you don't get to see that, right? That is something sacred, and we need to maintain that distance.
Sorry,
I see that.
Yeah,
Go
sorry, I was
ahead,
going to say,
Barry.
Sarah, just two questions, but I'm not sure if you can see one or either of them. One is directly for you, and the other is more generally. If you can't, I can relate.
I see Allie's. Hi, Allie. Nice to see you out there. I wonder if this might be a great little thought of,
no, thanks. I'm good. Cheers. Thank you so much.
about what to do when you have an audience that's perhaps unwilling to hear this or have this conversation. And I think actually Yaki and Baal might be the answer to this, of like that it's a different, I mean, you run into issues, right? That I think an audience that's used to theater happening in a certain way is going to find that experience different, right? So how do we get those in? But the way that the audience and the storytellers interact in Yaki and Baal is perhaps might create that willingness to engage. I don't know, Sarah, so I'm going to throw this over to you if you want to speak about that a bit, how it might access an audience that is resistant to this kind of intercultural conversation.
It's a very good question. And one of the things in my own set of principles that I developed for this particular performance is to check in regularly with the cast and the writer and the director and say, we're seeing this in the news. These things, may I talk about them in the lobby display, for example, in order to make a connection between what's happening on stage and things that are happening in the everyday world of our presumed audience. So that's one way that I look to do it. But also Karen Jean is right, because the play, which is on in the Galway Theatre Festival, by the way, come and see it, because the play is kind of two cultures speaking to each other. The people who might be in between, who might not really be in part of either of those cultures or willing to engage with the histories that we're talking about, have a chance to be sitting in that in between, and be given the opportunity to act, literally in the case of Yaki and Baal, by writing down something simple that the actors will then take and improvise on, but also just by watching people navigate that sense of not belonging to either one, and do I have the right, or do I care enough to interject myself in these histories? So I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know we have like 1 minute.
We have one more question. So
there was one more question from
one more question.
Wahid Talib, and it was for you, Sarah. I might just relay it just for reasons of time, but it was a question on applying, or do you try to apply, I guess, this processes of dramaturgy and how you do that to Irish theatre and text of plays, which is another big question, but maybe just in an Irish context. Have you undertaken similar work?
My dramaturgical experience has been entirely in the US and Ireland. So are we talking specifically about plays in Irish, or about, because I haven't worked with those. I don't have Irish very well at all. But let me see if I can read the question.
Or if you're still with us, Wakib, please feel free to unmute and ask.
Yes, I am with you. Okay,
Good.
I think, okay. I am specialized with the theater and with the drama. Therefore, I ask this question because I read whether there is application.
Oh no.
Oh, did she drop off?
Yes.
Wakib is still with us. I think she's going back.
Yes. I think they're there. Thanks, Maya.
Just unmute and hopefully we can pick up the conversation again.
Yes, I ask about the application. I know there is a conversation between the actors, between the characters in the play. We can apply it, and if we apply it, we can find, for example, articles by Dr. Sarah or by Dr. Karen Jane. They try to apply this study.
Karen Jane is definitely published.
Yes.
I'm sorry. What's the heart of the question? I just missed it.
Do you have publications that you might recommend?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, about doing this work. Actually, I co-wrote an article with Nicola Olson where we talked about the processes that inhibited the work at ASU. Things like box office, things like seating, these things. And I think it's about how we have to be attentive to all these details if we're actually going to create new spaces and new places of coming together. So that's published in the LMDA review. It's called Tripped Up by the Small Things. Dramaturging the Processes of Indian School or something. I can't exactly remember the thing. And then, yeah, I think that's the main one where that was like really dissecting and sort of dramaturging the processes that surrounded that and how our production processes failed us in that instance. So I think that is less focused on text and more on the experience. But I can point you to that. Yeah.
Okay, well, that brings us up to time, maybe. I think I can just maybe step in here and just wrap up formally on behalf of ISTR and just offer a real word of thanks to our two brilliant conversationalists and speakers and dramaturgs and all the many hats they wear, to Dr. Sarah Hoover and Dr. Karen Jean Martinsen. A big round of virtual applause to you both, and thank you for all the insights and generosity and sharing all the wonderful work you both do and are part of. Just to finish up on, I just put a link in the chat to some recordings of previous webinars hosted by the Irish Society for Theatre Research, and we will have more events coming in the months ahead in February and March, so stay tuned for updates for what those will be. The website is very simply istr.ie, and you can keep up to date with all activities, including the ISTR conference coming up at Villanova University in the US. So still time to get your papers in, and we'll hopefully see some faces there. So just offer thanks again to Sarah, Karen Jean, to Ciara Murphy as well, or Dr. Ciara Murphy, our ISTR colleague, for welcoming at the beginning. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you all at the next ISTR webinar and event, virtually or in person soon again. So thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.